Whispers of the Wind by Edwin Longbottom. Chapter 1. A Quiet Morning Disrupted. The village of Barrowfield lay nestled amidst the rolling green hills of the English countryside, a picture of pastoral serenity where time seemed to stroll rather than march forward. Thick hedgerows divided the land into a patchwork quilt of pastures, meadows, and crop fields, while narrow, winding lanes connected the heart of the village to the far-flung farms that dotted the landscape. Early morning light filtered through a gauzy mist, casting a golden glow over dew-drenched grass. The hum of wind turbines stood in stark contrast to the timeless charm of the village. These towering sentinels spun lazily in the gentle breeze, their rhythmic rotations whispering secrets to the surrounding hills. For most residents, the turbines had become part of the landscape, as unremarkable as the weathered stone walls that lined the fields. But for some, they were an unwelcome emblem of progress intruding upon a place content in its simplicity. Farmer Reginald Webb was among those who had reluctantly accepted their presence. A man of sturdy build and ruddy complexion, Reginald prided himself on his adherence to routine. Each morning he rose before the first hint of dawn, slipping on his well-worn boots and heading out to tend to his animals. His sheep, ever the creatures of habit, bleated softly as he approached, their woolly forms like shadows in the mist. This particular morning began no differently. The air carried the earthy scent of damp soil, mingled with the faint tang of livestock. Reginald whistled tunelessly as he worked, his mind preoccupied with the week's tasks, mending fences, replenishing hay, and preparing for the village fair. But as he approached the edge of his property, where the wind turbines loomed like giants against the horizon, something caught his attention. A strange stillness had settled over the fields, broken only by the creak of the turbines. It was a quiet that pressed against his ears, unnerving in its intensity. Squinting against the low-hanging mist, Reginald noticed an unusual shape at the base of the nearest turbine. His steps slowed, boots sinking into the soft ground as he drew closer. What he found stopped him cold. There, bound grotesquely to the towering structure, was the lifeless body of Algernon Sterling, Barrowfield's wealthiest and most influential resident. Sterling's arms were tied behind him, his head slumped forward as if in reluctant submission to some unseen force. A garish propeller hat adorned his head, its colorful blades spinning lazily in the breeze, a macabre mimicry of the turbines themselves. Reginald stumbled back, the sight searing itself into his mind. Sterling's face, pale and slack, seemed to leer at him with a grim mockery. The farmer's breath came in shallow gasps as he turned and broke into a run, his sturdy legs carrying him toward the village center. He had to alert the others. The church bell tolled soon after, shattering the morning's fragile calm. It rang not with its usual cadence of serenity, but with an urgency that rippled through the village like a stone dropped into still water. Doors creaked open, heads poked out, and murmurs began to swell as the news spread. The residents of Barrowfield, long accustomed to their sleepy existence, found themselves thrust into a storm of speculation and fear. Within the hour, the village green was crowded with onlookers. Men and women huddled in clusters, their voices low but insistent as they exchanged theories about the grisly discovery. "Who could have done such a thing?" whispered Mrs. Harriet Cromwell, her hands trembling as she clutched her shawl. "Sterling had plenty of enemies," muttered George Wilkins, the village blacksmith. "The man made no friends buying up half the land around here." Nearby, the vicar, Reverend Aldridge, stood grim-faced, his eyes fixed on the distant turbines. "We must pray for his soul," he intoned, though his voice lacked conviction. The arrival of the constable brought a measure of order to the chaos. He cordoned off the area around the turbine, his face pale beneath his helmet as he surveyed the scene. "Everyone back to your homes," he barked, though few heeded his command. Meanwhile, Reginald stood at the edge of the crowd, his hands clenched into fists as he replayed the morning's events in his mind. His unease deepened as he overheard snippets of conversation, a simmering undercurrent of anger and suspicion that seemed to envelop the villagers like a storm cloud. Barrowfield, with its picture-perfect charm, had always felt untouched by the troubles of the wider world. But now, a shadow had fallen over its tranquil hills, and the whispers of the wind carried a darker tune. Chapter 2. Enter Inspector Langley. The news of Algernon Sterling's murder traveled swiftly, carried beyond the borders of Barrowfield by the constable's urgent telegram to the county headquarters. Within hours, the case landed on the desk of Inspector Geoffrey Langley, a seasoned detective whose reputation for unraveling complex mysteries was rivaled only by his fondness for a well-brewed cup of tea. Langley sat in his modest office, poring over the preliminary report with furrowed brows. The details were sparse but intriguing. A prominent landowner murdered in a small village, his body staged in a manner both theatrical and grotesque. It was the kind of case that stirred the embers of Langley's investigative instincts, which had dimmed somewhat over his decades-long career. "You're awfully quiet," remarked Detective Tom Harris, his young partner, as he leaned against the doorway. Harris, fresh-faced and eager, had joined Langley 6 months ago and quickly earned a reputation for his meticulous attention to detail. Langley glanced up, his steely gray eyes glinting with a mix of curiosity and determination. "Quiet is the sound of thoughts connecting," he replied. "This case, it's not just murder, it's a performance. Someone wanted to send a message. Or someone wanted to confuse us," Harris countered, stepping into the office. "A propeller hat tied to a wind turbine? It reeks of misdirection." Langley smiled faintly, appreciating the lad's skepticism. "Perhaps, but even misdirection has its purpose." By mid-morning, the two detectives were en route to Barrowfield, their unmarked car winding through narrow country roads framed by gnarled oaks and moss-covered stone walls. Harris drove in companionable silence, occasionally stealing glances at his mentor. Langley, with his neatly combed silver hair and impeccably pressed suit, exuded an air of quiet authority that belied the sharp mind beneath. "What do you know about Barrowfield?" Harris asked as they neared the village. "Quaint, isolated, resistant to change," Langley replied. "The sort of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, or thinks they do. Sounds like fertile ground for secrets." "Precisely." They arrived at the scene just as the constable was struggling to maintain control of the curious crowd. The green was alive with murmurs and pointing fingers, the villagers' faces a mosaic of fear, curiosity, and in some cases, thinly veiled delight at the drama unfolding in their midst. Langley stepped out of the car, surveying the scene with practiced detachment. His gaze lingered on the towering wind turbines, their blades slicing through the air with an almost hypnotic grace. There was something both serene and menacing about them, their presence a stark reminder of the tension between progress and tradition that simmered beneath Barrowfield's surface. "Inspector Langley," the constable greeted him, tipping his helmet. "I've kept the area secure as best I could, but the villagers, well, you see how they are." "Human nature," Langley replied with a nod. "Where there's a spectacle, there's an audience. Have you interviewed anyone yet?" "Not properly, sir. I thought it best to wait for your arrival." "Good. Let's keep it that way. First impressions are invaluable." As Langley approached the turbine where Sterling's body had been found, Harris fell into step beside him, a notebook already in hand. The ground around the site had been churned by multiple sets of footprints, making it difficult to discern any fresh tracks. The body had been removed earlier that morning, but the scene retained an eerie air, the propeller hat left untouched as a grim reminder of the crime. "Who found him?" Langley asked. "Farmer Reginald Webb," the constable replied. "He's over there." He gestured toward a stocky man standing apart from the crowd, his face pale and drawn. Langley approached Reginald, extending a hand in greeting. "Farmer Webb, I'm Inspector Langley. I understand you made the discovery." Reginald nodded, his grip firm but clammy. "Aye, that's right. Never seen anything like it in all my years. Poor Mr. Sterling. Can you walk me through exactly what happened?" Reginald recounted the morning's events in halting detail, his voice thick with emotion. Langley listened intently, his sharp eyes scanning Reginald's face for any flicker of hesitation or inconsistency. When the farmer finished, Langley patted his shoulder reassuringly. "You've done the right thing, Mr. Webb. Now, if you'll excuse me, we have work to do." He rejoined Harris near the turbine, where the younger detective was examining the ground. "What do you make of it?" Langley asked. "There's something off about the staging," Harris replied. "The hat, the bindings, it feels deliberate, but not rushed. Whoever did this took their time." "Which means they weren't afraid of being caught," Langley said. "This wasn't a crime of passion. It was planned. As they continued to inspect the site, Langley's thoughts turned to the village itself. In a place like Barrowfield, where every action was scrutinized and every secret had a dozen witnesses, the murder of someone as prominent as Algernon Sterling would send shockwaves through the community. But shockwaves could also dislodge truths long buried, and Langley intended to uncover every last one of them. Chapter 3: The Whirlwind of Suspicions. The green of Barrowfield was alive with movement as villagers lingered on the periphery of the investigation, their whispers rising like smoke into the crisp morning air. Each resident seemed to harbor an unspoken theory, their glances darting between one another as if searching for signs of guilt. The murder of Algernon Sterling had become the village's unexpected centerpiece, and everyone had their own stake in the narrative. Inspector Langley and Detective Harris began their work, navigating through the crowd like fishermen casting nets for elusive truths. The villagers' faces betrayed a range of emotions: shock, anger, and in some cases barely concealed satisfaction. Langley's practiced eye swept over them, cataloging expressions and gestures, each a potential thread in the tapestry of lies and half-truths they would need to unravel. "We'll start with those closest to Sterling," Langley said, gesturing toward the housekeeper, Mrs. Edith Hargrove, who stood near the church steps, her hands twisting nervously in her apron. "She's likely to know more about his habits than anyone." As they approached, Mrs. Hargrove's wide, watery eyes flitted to Langley. "Inspector," she greeted him, her voice quavering. "It's terrible, just terrible. Poor Mr. Sterling." "I understand you worked for Mr. Sterling for many years," Langley began, his tone gentle but probing. "Nearly 20, she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "He was a demanding man, but he was generous in his way." Langley's eyebrow arched slightly. "In his way?" Mrs. Hargrove hesitated, her gaze dropping to the ground. "He could be harsh," she admitted, "particular about how things were done. And he had a temper, especially when it came to his business dealings." "Did you notice anything unusual in the days leading up to his death?" Langley pressed. Her hands trembled as she wrung the edges of her apron. "There were arguments," she whispered. "Voices raised in the study late at night. I didn't hear everything, but it seemed serious." "Do you know who he was arguing with?" She shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "I'm sorry, Inspector. I didn't dare intrude." Langley nodded, offering her a brief word of comfort before moving on. As he and Harris approached the next cluster of villagers, his mind turned over Mrs. Hargrove's words. Arguments in the study suggested conflict, a motive perhaps, but with whom? The next person of interest was Fiona Meadows, the village's most outspoken environmental activist. Fiona had been a thorn in Sterling's side for years, her protests against the wind turbines well documented and often public. She stood apart from the crowd, her arms crossed and her expression tight. "You've made your feelings about Mr. Sterling quite clear in the past," Langley said as they approached her. "Do you mind if we ask where you were last night?" Fiona's green eyes flashed with indignation. "I was at the community hall," she replied sharply. "We had a meeting about the annual village fete. You can ask anyone who was there." Langley noted her defiance but pressed on. "You've accused Mr. Sterling of ruining the countryside with his turbines. Did your animosity ever escalate beyond words?" Her gaze narrowed. "I'm not denying I had issues with him, Inspector, but murder? Do I look like a killer to you?" "No one looks like a killer until they are one," Langley replied evenly, watching her reaction. She held his gaze, her jaw tight, but there was a flicker of something. Fear or guilt, he couldn't be sure. As Fiona walked away, Harris leaned in. "She's hiding something," he murmured. "Most people are," Langley replied. "The trick is finding out what and why." The next interview brought them face to face with Rupert Hastings, a man whose professional ambitions had repeatedly clashed with Sterling's dominance in the local business landscape. Hastings was the picture of calm, his posture relaxed, and his tone measured as he answered their questions. Yet Langley's intuition prickled. Hastings was too composed, his answers rehearsed. "I was home all evening," Hastings said, spreading his hands as if to emphasize his innocence. "I had no quarrel with Algernon, despite what some might say." Langley tilted his head slightly. "No quarrel? Yet I understand your bid to develop the neighboring farmland was blocked by him just last month." Hastings's smile tightened. That's business, Inspector. It's nothing personal. Langley let the statement hang in the air, watching the flicker of irritation that crossed Hastings's face before he masked it. Of course, Langley said smoothly. Thank you for your time. By late afternoon, they turned their attention to Eleanor Sterling, the widow. Draped in black, Eleanor had the bearing of a woman accustomed to admiration, her poise impeccable even in grief. She greeted the detectives with a somber nod, her voice steady as she answered their questions. My husband was a complicated man, she admitted. He had his flaws, but he cared deeply for this village. And yet he had his share of enemies, Langley said. Did he share any concerns with you in recent days? She hesitated, her hands smoothing the folds of her dress. He mentioned tension with some of the villagers, but he didn't give specifics. Langley studied her closely. There was a brittleness beneath her composure, a tension that suggested more than grief. Mrs. Sterling, where were you last night? Her eyes darted to the side just for a moment. At home, she said. I went to bed early. And your staff can confirm that? Her pause was imperceptible, but Langley caught it. Yes, she said. I'm sure they can. As they walked away, Harris glanced at his mentor. You think she's lying? Langley's lips twitched into a faint smile. Everyone lies, Harris. The question is, what are they lying about? As dusk fell over Barrowfield, the whispers of the villagers grew louder, their suspicions weaving a web of intrigue around the murder. Langley and Harris, their minds brimming with questions, returned to their lodgings to review the day's findings. The picture was far from complete, but one thing was clear. The truth lay buried beneath the surface, waiting for those brave enough to uncover it. Chapter 4. Tracing threads of betrayal, nightfall cloaked Barrowfield in an uneasy stillness. The wind turbines, their blades lit by faint red warning lights, seemed to loom larger in the dark, their rhythmic whirring a haunting backdrop to the day's events. Inside their modest lodgings at the village inn, Inspector Langley and Detective Harris sat at a small table strewn with notes and photographs. A single oil lamp cast flickering shadows across the walls as they reviewed the day's findings. Let's recap, Langley began, his tone measured. We have a prominent victim, Algernon Sterling, murdered and staged in a grotesque manner. We have multiple suspects, each with a potential motive, financial grievances, environmental feuds, personal betrayal. What we don't have is a clear link tying anyone definitively to the crime. Harris nodded, flipping through his notebook. Fiona Meadows was evasive about her whereabouts. Rupert Hastings was too polished, almost rehearsed, and Eleanor Sterling. He paused, considering his words. There's something off about her grief. It feels performative. Langley leaned back in his chair, his steely eyes thoughtful. Performative grief often hides something else, guilt, fear, or complicity. But we need evidence, not instincts. A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. The constable entered, his face pale and his hands clutching a crumpled piece of paper. Found this, sirs, he said, placing the paper on the table. It was tucked behind a drawer in Sterling's study. Langley unfolded the sheet carefully. The handwriting was sharp and deliberate, the words tinged with menace. The meeting is set. Come alone or face the consequences. The note was unsigned, but the implication was clear. Langley and Harris exchanged a glance. A clandestine meeting, Harris mused. Likely the night of the murder. Langley tapped the paper with his forefinger. The question is, who sent it, and did Sterling attend? The next morning, Langley and Harris returned to the Sterling estate. The sprawling property was a curious blend of old-world charm and modern industrialism, its grand stone facade overshadowed by the towering wind turbines beyond. Inside, the study was as Langley had expected, meticulously organized, with an air of authority that mirrored its late occupant. Harris examined the desk where the note had been found. If Sterling did attend a meeting that night, it could explain the argument Mrs. Hargrove overheard. Indeed, Langley replied, his eyes scanning the room, and it suggests the meeting didn't end amicably. A thorough search of the study yielded another clue, a torn corner of paper wedged beneath the heavy mahogany desk. Langley retrieved it, noting that the edge matched the note found earlier. Someone was in a hurry, he murmured, showing it to Harris. Perhaps the sender was less careful than they intended. The discovery deepened the mystery. but it was a chance encounter later that morning that shifted the investigation. As the detectives walked through the village, they encountered Roger Merton, a farmer whose family had long feuded with Sterling over disputed land. Merton, a wiry man with sun-weathered skin, greeted them with a wary nod. "Inspector," he said, his voice tinged with resentment, "what can I do for you?" "We'd like to ask about your history with Mr. Sterling," Langley said, his tone neutral. Merton's jaw tightened. "There's not much to say. He took what wasn't his, land that's been in my family for generations." "And you never tried to take it back?" Harris asked, his curiosity piqued. Merton's eyes flashed with anger. "I fought him in court, but the system favors the rich. Fighting any other way, that's not how I was raised." Langley noted the man's indignation, but detected no hint of deception. "Did you see or speak to Mr. Sterling recently?" Merton hesitated before answering. "We crossed paths a week ago at the market. He made some snide comment about the turbines, said I should be grateful they're beautifying the land." His voice dripped with bitterness. "I told him I didn't want his machines scarring my fields." As they walked away, Harris turned to Langley. "He's angry enough to have done it." "Perhaps," Langley replied, "but anger doesn't always translate to action. We need more than a grudge." The day wore on, and the detectives pieced together fragments of conversations, observations, and intuition. By evening, a clearer picture began to emerge. Sterling had been a man of many contradictions, a benefactor to some, a tyrant to others. His influence had cast long shadows over Barrowfield, and those shadows concealed secrets that were only now beginning to surface. The breakthrough came just before dusk, when Harris returned from the village archives with a bundle of documents. "Found this in the Planning Commission files," he announced, spreading the papers on the table. Langley leaned over, his interest piqued. The documents detailed Sterling's acquisition of the land where the turbines now stood. One page, in particular, caught Langley's eye: a signed agreement between Sterling and an unnamed party. The handwriting on the agreement bore a striking resemblance to the note found in the study. "Whoever sent that note had dealings with Sterling," Langley said, his voice low, "and those dealings went sour." As the turbines turned silently in the distance, Langley felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to align. The murder was no random act of violence. It was the culmination of a web of betrayal and ambition. But who had spun that web, and why? The answer, Langley knew, lay in the shadows cast by Barrowfield's wind-whispered hills, and he intended to drag those shadows into the light. Chapter 5: Unraveling the Wind's Whisper. The following morning dawned cold and gray, the sky a blanket of low-hanging clouds that seemed to press down on the village. The wind turbines spun slowly, their mechanical hum a constant undercurrent as Langley and Harris resumed their work. The note found in Sterling's study had become the centerpiece of their investigation, a tantalizing thread that hinted at hidden truths yet to be uncovered. Their first stop was the village archives, where Harris had uncovered the Planning Commission documents the evening before. The clerk, an elderly man with a sharp memory and an apparent fondness for local gossip, greeted them warmly. "I trust you're finding everything you need?" the clerk asked, his tone conspiratorial. "Strange business, this murder. But then Mr. Sterling had a way of stirring up trouble." Langley offered a polite nod. "We're particularly interested in the acquisition of the land where the turbines now stand. Do you recall any disputes during that process?" The clerk's brow furrowed as he rifled through his mental catalog. "Ah, yes. That was quite the uproar at the time. The Merton family was particularly vocal, claimed the land had been taken under questionable circumstances. But there were others, too, people who thought Sterling's ambitions would ruin the village." "Do you remember anyone who might have had private dealings with Sterling?" Langley pressed. The clerk hesitated, then leaned in conspiratorially. "There was talk of a deal made in secret. Someone who sold their claim to the land for a tidy sum. No one ever figured out who it was, though." Langley exchanged a glance with Harris. The unnamed party on the agreement loomed larger in their minds, a shadowy figure whose involvement could be key to understanding the murder. Back at the Sterling estate, the study had become a treasure trove of clues. Langley and Harris sifted through stacks of correspondence, financial records, and contracts, their search methodical and unyielding. It was Harris who discovered the next crucial piece of evidence. A letter tucked inside a locked drawer, its seal broken but still intact. Langley read the letter aloud, his voice steady despite the tension in the words. "You think your power protects you, but you've underestimated what I'm capable of. Meet me at the turbine field tonight, or the whole village will know what you've done." The letter was unsigned, but its implications were damning. Langley set it down carefully, his mind racing. "This wasn't just a meeting," he said. "It was an ultimatum." "And it wasn't Sterling who wrote it," Harris added. "It's addressed to him. Someone wanted to confront him, publicly, if necessary." Langley nodded, his thoughts coalescing. Whoever wrote this letter must have known Sterling's secrets, and they were desperate enough to threaten exposure. As the day unfolded, the detectives turned their attention to the key suspects. Their interviews grew sharper, their questions more pointed. The tension among the villagers was palpable, each encounter layered with unease. Fiona Meadows was the first to face their renewed scrutiny. The environmentalist's fiery rhetoric had made her a natural suspect, but her alibi for the night of the murder remained steadfast. "I told you," Fiona snapped, her frustration boiling over. "I was at the community hall with half the village. You can check the attendance log." "And yet you've been outspoken about Sterling for years," Langley countered. "Your protests were well documented. Did you ever confront him personally?" Fiona hesitated, her green eyes narrowing. "Yes, I confronted him. But words aren't weapons, Inspector. I fought him with petitions, not violence." Langley leaned closer, his gaze piercing. "Did you know about the secret deals he made? The ones that undermined the very land you fought to protect?" Fiona's lips parted in surprise, but she quickly recovered. "No, but it doesn't surprise me. Sterling was a man who thought he could buy anything." Langley filed her reaction away, his instincts telling him there was more to her story. Next, they confronted Rupert Hastings. The businessman's polished demeanor had already raised suspicions, and the letter added weight to their concerns. "You told us you had no quarrel with Mr. Sterling," Langley began, his voice calm but firm. "Yet we've found evidence suggesting otherwise." Hastings bristled, his composure cracking. "What evidence?" Langley produced a copy of the unsigned agreement from the Planning Commission documents. "This signature bears a striking resemblance to yours, Mr. Hastings. Care to explain?" For a moment, Hastings said nothing, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Then he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Fine, I signed the agreement. Sterling paid me to withdraw my bid for the land. It was a calculated move. Business, nothing more." "And the letter in Sterling's study?" Harris pressed. "Did you write it?" Hastings' eyes widened in genuine shock. "No, I swear, I didn't write any letter." Langley studied him carefully, weighing his words. Hastings' confession complicated matters, but it didn't place him at the scene of the crime. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Langley and Harris regrouped at the inn. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align, but the picture remained incomplete. "It all comes back to the turbine field," Langley said, his voice low. "That's where Sterling was confronted. That's where he died. And that's where we'll find our answers." Harris nodded, his resolve matching his mentor's. "What's the plan?" "We revisit the scene," Langley replied. "We missed something the first time, something that will point us to the truth." As they prepared for the long night ahead, the wind outside picked up, its whispers growing louder as if urging them forward. The turbines stood as silent witnesses to the secrets buried in Barrowfield's hills, their blades slicing through the dark with relentless precision. And in their shadows, Langley and Harris knew the answers waited to be uncovered. Chapter 6: Shadows in the Turbine Field. The turbine field was a different place at night. Under the moon's silver gaze, the towering structures seemed more alive, their blades slicing through the air with a hypnotic rhythm. The wind carried an eerie symphony of creaks and hums, punctuated by the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. Langley and Harris approached the scene with flashlights in hand, their beams cutting through the darkness. "This is where Sterling was found," Harris said, his voice low. "But it feels different now." "Everything looks different in the dark," Langley replied. "But the truth doesn't change." The ground around the turbine's base had been cleared of Sterling's body and the propeller hat, yet the area still carried an unsettling energy. Langley crouched low, his keen eyes scanning the earth for anything the daylight might have concealed. "Here," he said, motioning for Harris to join him. "What do you make of this?" Harris knelt beside him, examining the faint impressions in the soil. They were footprints, partially obscured by the elements, but distinct enough to discern. The prints led away from the turbine toward the edge of the field, where the tall grass swayed like restless waves. "Whoever left these was in a hurry," Harris observed. "The stride is uneven." Langley nodded, rising to his feet. "Let's follow them." The detectives moved carefully, their flashlights illuminating the narrow trail through the grass. The wind grew stronger as they ventured farther from the village, its whispers carrying fragments of voices that seemed almost human. Harris shivered, but whether from the cold or the atmosphere, he couldn't tell. The trail ended abruptly at a small, dilapidated shed, its wooden planks warped and weathered by time. Langley approached it cautiously, his flashlight revealing a rusted padlock hanging loosely from the door. "Looks like someone's been here recently," Harris said, pointing to the fresh scuff marks on the lock. Langley didn't respond. Instead, he reached for the lock, testing its strength. It gave way with minimal effort, the door creaking open to reveal a dimly lit interior. The air inside was thick with the scent of oil and damp wood. "What is this place?" Harris asked, stepping inside. Langley's flashlight swept across the room, revealing a cluttered workspace filled with tools, papers, and what appeared to be turbine schematics. In the center of the room stood a table, its surface covered in maps and handwritten notes. "This isn't just a shed," Langley murmured. "It's a planning room." Harris picked up one of the maps, his brow furrowing. "These are detailed layouts of the turbine field. Someone was studying the area closely." Langley's attention was drawn to a set of photographs pinned to the wall. They depicted Sterling in various settings: at the village market, inspecting the turbines, and standing in what appeared to be a heated argument with an unseen figure. "Whoever was here was watching Sterling," Langley said. "This wasn't random. They were planning something." The discovery of the shed marked a turning point in the investigation. Back at the inn, Langley and Harris pored over the materials they had retrieved, piecing together the story behind the mysterious planning room. "The notes mention a meeting," Harris said, pointing to a scrawled line on one of the papers. "Final confrontation, midnight at Turbine 4. That's where Sterling was found." Langley nodded, his mind racing. The letter, the footprints, the shed, it all ties back to this meeting. But who set it up, and why? The answer came in the form of a name scribbled in the corner of one of the maps: R. Merton. "Roger Merton," Harris said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "He's been protesting Sterling for years." Langley leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "It fits. The land dispute, the personal animosity, the knowledge of the turbine field, but we still don't have the full picture." The following morning, they confronted Merton at his farm. The man's weathered face betrayed little as Langley laid out their findings. "We found your name on documents in a shed near the turbine field," Langley said. "Care to explain?" Merton crossed his arms, his gaze defiant. "That shed's been abandoned for years. Anyone could have used it." "True," Langley replied, "but not everyone had a motive to see Sterling dead." Merton's jaw tightened, his composure cracking. "You think I killed him? That I staged that grotesque scene?" "We think you were there," Harris interjected, "and we think you know who else was." For a long moment, Merton said nothing. Then, with a heavy sigh, he spoke. "I didn't kill him, but I was there that night. Sterling called me, said he wanted to make amends for the land dispute. I didn't believe him, but I went." "What happened?" Langley asked. Merton's eyes clouded with memory. "We argued. He refused to admit he'd stolen the land, said it was all business, nothing personal. I left before things got heated." "And who stayed behind?" Langley pressed. Merton hesitated, then whispered a name: Eleanor. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. Eleanor Sterling, the grieving widow, had been present at the scene of her husband's death. But was she a witness, or something more? As Langley and Harris prepared to confront her, the pieces of the Keth puzzle began to align. The confrontation at the turbine field, the letter in the study, the hidden planning room, it all pointed to a tangled web of betrayal and deceit. The turbines, their blades spinning ceaselessly against the gray sky, seemed to echo the village's secrets. whispering truths that Langley and Harris were determined to uncover. Chapter 7: Confrontation in the Shadows. Eleanor Sterling sat in the drawing room of her sprawling estate, the morning light streaming through the tall windows. She looked every inch the grieving widow, her black dress pristine, her face pale but composed. Yet as Inspector Langley and Detective Harris entered, her calm demeanor seemed to waver, her hands tightening on the armrests of her chair. "Mrs. Sterling," Langley began, his voice firm but not unkind, "we have some questions that require your urgent attention." Eleanor inclined her head slightly. "Of course, Inspector, anything to help find the person responsible for my husband's death." Langley's sharp eyes didn't miss the flicker of tension that crossed her face. "We've uncovered evidence that places you at the turbine field the night your husband was killed. Witnesses have confirmed your presence. Would you care to explain?" For a moment, Eleanor said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, before she finally spoke. "I did go to the turbine field that night. Algernon asked me to meet him there." "Why would your husband arrange such a meeting in the dead of night?" Harris asked, his tone skeptical. Eleanor's gaze dropped to her lap. "We hadn't been on the best of terms recently. He said he wanted to talk about the future, about making amends." Langley leaned forward slightly. "And did he?" Her hands twisted in her lap, a gesture at odds with her composed exterior. "We argued," she admitted, "about the turbines, the land disputes, everything. Algernon was stubborn, unwilling to admit his faults. I left before things escalated further." Langley's gaze was unwavering. "And yet, you didn't tell us this when we first spoke. Why?" Eleanor hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Because I knew how it would look. A widow at the scene of her husband's death. It's a scandal waiting to happen." Langley considered her words carefully. "You claim you left the scene before your husband was killed. Can anyone corroborate that?" She shook her head. "No, I walked home alone." Back at the inn, Langley and Harris reviewed the day's revelations. Eleanor's account was damning in its omissions, yet something about her story felt incomplete. "She's hiding something," Harris said, pacing the room. "Her hesitation, her evasiveness, it's like she's telling half the truth." Langley nodded thoughtfully. "But what's the other half? If she didn't kill her husband, why would she lie?" A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. The constable entered, holding a small evidence bag. Inside was a piece of fabric, torn and stained with what appeared to be blood. "Found this near the turbine field," the constable said. "Thought it might be important." Langley examined the fabric carefully. It was a rich black material, similar to the dress Eleanor had worn during their interview. He exchanged a look with Harris. "This might be the leverage we need." The next day, Langley and Harris returned to the Sterling estate. Eleanor greeted them with visible apprehension, her composed facade showing signs of strain. "Mrs. Sterling," Langley began, holding up the evidence bag, "we found this near the scene of your husband's murder. It matches the material of the dress you wore that night." Eleanor's face drained of color, her hands gripping the edge of the table for support. "I don't know how that got there." Langley's tone hardened. "No more half-truths, Mrs. Sterling. We need the full story, or this case will close with you as the prime suspect." Eleanor's lips trembled as she struggled to find the words. Finally, she sank into a chair, her head in her hands. "I didn't kill him," she said, her voice breaking, "but I wasn't the only one at the turbine field that night." Langley and Harris leaned forward, the tension in the room palpable. "Who else was there?" Harris asked. Eleanor looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and regret. "Rupert Hastings. He arrived just as I was leaving. They had a heated exchange. I didn't stay to hear what it was about." Langley's gaze narrowed. "And you didn't think to mention this earlier?" "I was scared," Eleanor admitted. "If Rupert killed Algernon, I didn't want to be implicated." The revelation cast a new light on the investigation. Rupert Hastings, with his polished demeanor and veiled resentment, had suddenly become their most compelling suspect. Langley and Harris wasted no time seeking him out. Hastings was at his office in the village, his usual air of confidence noticeably strained. When confronted with Eleanor's testimony, his composure cracked. "Yes, I was there," he admitted, his voice tight. "Algernon called me, demanded I meet him. He wanted to renegotiate the land deal, said he'd expose me if I didn't comply." And did you comply? Langley asked. Hastings' jaw tightened. No, I refused. We argued, but I left before anything happened. Convenient, Harris said, his tone laced with skepticism. But your name is on the documents in the shed, and your dealings with Sterling were anything but clean. Hastings' expression darkened. If you're suggesting I killed him, you're wrong. I wanted nothing more to do with him. But if you're looking for someone with a real motive, you should talk to Fiona Meadows. Langley's eyes narrowed. Why Fiona? Hastings smirked. Because she hated him more than anyone, and she's not as innocent as she pretends to be. As the detectives left Hastings's office, the pieces of the puzzle began to shift once again. The web of lies and betrayals surrounding Algernon Sterling's death was more tangled than they had imagined, each revelation pulling them deeper into the shadows. The turbines stood silent and imposing against the evening sky, their blades slicing through the fading light. Langley knew the answers were close, but the path to them was fraught with danger. In Barrowfield, where the whispers of the wind carried more than secrets, the truth was a blade waiting to cut. Chapter 8: The Final Threads. The tension in Barrowfield was palpable as the investigation reached its crescendo. The villagers, once merely spectators, now felt the weight of the inquiry pressing against their daily lives. Whispers grew louder, alliances shifted, and the shadow of Algernon Sterling's death loomed over every interaction. Inspector Langley and Detective Harris prepared for what they hoped would be the final push to uncover the truth. Fiona Meadows, Langley said as they walked toward her modest cottage on the outskirts of the village. Hastings claims she's more involved than she appears. If she's hiding something, we need to bring it to light. Harris nodded. She's passionate about her causes, but passion can turn dangerous when it festers into hate. Fiona greeted them with visible annoyance, her arms crossed as she stood in her doorway. I've already told you everything I know, Inspector. How many more times must we do this? Until we're satisfied, Miss Meadows. Langley replied evenly. This isn't a casual inquiry. A man is dead, and we believe you have information that could help us understand why. Fiona sighed and stepped aside, allowing them into her small but meticulously kept home. The walls were lined with books on environmentalism and local history, her passions evident in every detail. Let's start with the night of the murder, Langley said, taking a seat at the small kitchen table. You claim you were at the community hall, yet several witnesses don't recall seeing you after the meeting began. Fiona stiffened. I was there, Inspector. Just because a few people don't remember doesn't mean I wasn't. Or it means you left early, Harris countered. Perhaps to confront Sterling? Her eyes flashed with anger. I didn't kill him, if that's what you're suggesting. Yes, I hated what he did to this village, but I fought him with petitions and protests, not violence. Langley reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a photograph from the planning room they had discovered. It showed Fiona in a heated argument with Sterling near the turbines, her expression fierce. This doesn't look like a peaceful protest, Langley said, placing the photograph on the table. Fiona's face drained of color. That was months ago. We argued, yes, but it wasn't about the turbines. Then what was it about? Langley pressed. Fiona hesitated, her hands trembling. He threatened to destroy the meadow behind my house, wanted to build another row of turbines. It's a nesting ground for rare birds. I begged him to reconsider, but he wouldn't listen. And did you threaten him in return? Harris asked, his voice sharp. Fiona's shoulders sagged. I told him he'd regret it if he went through with his plans. But I didn't mean I'd hurt him. I was desperate, not dangerous. Langley studied her carefully. Her passion was undeniable, but her fears seemed genuine. Do you have anyone who can confirm where you were after the meeting? Fiona shook her head. I walked home alone. No one saw me. Langley exchanged a glance with Harris. The pieces were aligning, but there were still gaps in the story. As they left Fiona's home, Harris turned to Langley. She's hiding something, but I don't think she killed him. Agreed, Langley said. But her connection to the turbines and to Sterling is significant. There's more to this than she's letting on. Their next stop was the constable's office, where they reviewed the evidence collected from the turbine field. The torn fabric, the letter, the planning documents, all pointed to a complex web of motives and opportunities. It keeps coming back to that planning room, Harris said. Whoever used it was meticulous. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act. Langley nodded, his mind racing. We need to confront Eleanor Sterling one last time. If she knows more than she's told us, now is the time to press her. Eleanor was waiting for them in the estate's drawing room, her composure once again betraying cracks as Langley and Harris entered. "Inspector," she said, her voice tight, "have you made any progress?" "We have," Langley replied, his tone firm, "and we believe you know more about your husband's death than you've admitted." Her hands clenched the armrests of her chair. "I've told you everything." Langley leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "You told us you left the turbine field before anything happened, but Fiona Meadows claims otherwise. She says she saw you arguing with Sterling shortly before he died." Eleanor's face paled. "She's lying." "And then there's this," Langley continued, holding up the torn fabric. "Found at the scene of the crime. It matches the dress you wore that night." Her breathing quickened, her composure unraveling. "You don't understand. It wasn't supposed to happen like this." Langley's voice softened, but his words carried weight. "Then tell us what did happen. The truth, Mrs. Sterling. No more half measures." Eleanor buried her face in her hands, her voice muffled as she spoke. "Algernon was a cruel man. He controlled everything, me, the village, the land. That night, I went to the turbines to confront him. I told him I couldn't live like this anymore." "What happened next?" Harris asked, his tone gentler now. "He laughed," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He said I was nothing without him, that no one would believe me if I tried to leave. I was furious, but I didn't hurt him." Langley pressed gently. "But someone did." Eleanor looked up, her eyes filled with despair. "It was Rupert. He arrived after me. They argued, and then I left. I couldn't watch anymore." The final piece fell into place as Langley and Harris confronted Rupert Hastings later that evening. Cornered by the evidence and Eleanor's testimony, Hastings broke down. "Yes, I killed him," he confessed, his voice shaking. "He pushed me too far, the land, the lies, the manipulation. I couldn't take it anymore." "And the staging?" Langley asked. "The propeller hat, the turbine, it was grotesque." Hastings nodded, his face pale. "I wanted to humiliate him, to show the village the truth about who he was." As Hastings was led away in handcuffs, the turbines continued their silent vigil over Barrowfield, their blades slicing through the night as if cutting away the lies that had long festered in the village. Langley and Harris stood beneath their towering shadows, the weight of the case settling over them. "The truth is never simple," Langley said quietly. "No," Harris replied, "but it's always worth finding." Epilogue. Whispers carried by the wind. The quiet of Barrowfield returned with the dawn. The village, once fractured by secrets and suspicion, began to stitch itself together in the wake of Rupert Hastings' arrest. Whispers of the murder that had shaken their small community gave way to murmurs of reflection, of resilience. The turbines stood as silent witnesses to the upheaval, their blades turning steadily against the endless horizon. Inspector Langley and Detective Harris walked through the village one last time, their work here complete. The investigation had been grueling, but it had revealed more than the truth behind Algernon Sterling's death. It had laid bare the complexity of human ambition, the fragility of trust, and the enduring power of redemption. At the Sterling estate, Eleanor had retreated into solitude. The weight of her husband's life and death lingered, but with it came the possibility of a future unshackled from his shadow. She was often seen walking among the turbines, her face turned to the wind as if listening to the whispers of the past, now mingled with the promise of tomorrow. Fiona Meadows returned to her advocacy, her voice stronger but tempered by the lessons of recent events. Her protests gained a new focus, her passion rooted not in opposition, but in collaboration, finding ways to protect the land without tearing the community apart. Roger Merton, once consumed by bitterness, found a strange solace in the resolution of the case. His anger at Sterling had been real, but the truth had unburdened him in a way he hadn't anticipated. Slowly, he began to repair his relationships with the villagers, reclaiming his place in the community. As for Langley and Harris, their bond as partners had deepened. Langley's sharp instincts and Harris's meticulous nature had proven a formidable combination, and both men had learned from the other. For Langley, the case had rekindled his purpose, a reminder of why he had chosen this path so many years ago. For Harris, it was a baptism by fire, a trial that had honed his skills and solidified his resolve. Standing by their car, Langley took one last look at the village. "Barrowfield will heal," he said, his voice steady, "but it won't forget." Harris nodded, "And neither will we." As they drove away, the turbines faded into the distance, their blades a blur against the morning sky. The wind carried the echoes of all that had transpired, of ambition, betrayal, justice, and hope. Barrowfield would go on, its whispers a testament to the resilience of its people and the enduring quest for truth. The end. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe,